This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hi there. With the COVID-19 spreading rapidly across the globe, investors are alarmed about the extent of the blow to consumer spending, businesses and supply chains, and have sent financial markets into a tailspin. Beyond the war on COVID-19, there is another fight against a political virus and discrimination amid the crisis. So what impact will the epidemic have on the world's largest economies, not to mention emerging markets? How could daily life be changed as a result? And what can be done to curb the negative impact and take responsibility in this global fight against the pandemic? To discuss these issues and more, I'm joined via satellite by Anthony Chan, former Chase chief economist at JP Morgan, and Anna Tungan, an independent current affairs commentator, via Skype by Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, and via telephone by Gilbert Rochard, founder and chairman of Meyermont Partners in Geneva. That's our topic. This is a dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to our discussion. First of all, Anna Tungan, given the roller coaster jitters in the stock markets of the United States and particularly the oil shocks, do you think the U.S. economy is in recession, or are we seeing the start of a serious recession for the American economy?
I think you are seeing the start of a recession. A recession, remember, is by definition 2 quarters back-to-back of negative growth. And I think it's quite clear that the U.S. might emerge from the first quarter okay, but the second and third quarters are being very problematic. There's going to be negative growth in there. Just, from what we've seen, GM has closed and Chrysler have closed their auto plants. You're seeing restaurants, anything to do with entertainment, travel, hotels, closing during this period. It's going to be very difficult. Remember, the reason for this is that 80% of America's spending has to do with not essentials, but basically choice items. So it's not about necessities. What drives the American economy is this idea of choice, and when there is no spending, it has a ripple effect that creates a negative downward spiral.
But Charles, let's look at COVID-19. Do you think the latest escalation of the tensions regarding the severity of the epidemic is a matter of choice for President Trump, who allegedly lied, denied, and now tried to use blame game to divert public attention from domestic woes in an election year? Charles?
Well, there's absolutely no question that he's taken 180-degree turns on everything concerning this virus for the last 2 to 3 months. It's amazing how he can turn from, oh, we got it under control, everything's okay, we don't have to take this seriously, a lot more people die of the flu, to what he's doing today. What he's done is squander the time that the Chinese efforts had created for him and squandered it by playing politics. And there's hell to pay for this, because the situation in the U.S. is getting very serious, politically, economically, and health-wise. It's not going to be easy for them to build all the facilities necessary when these cases start to come. America is pretty much like Italy 2 weeks ago. And we're going to see escalation, massive escalation, as the governor of New York said. We're looking at tens of thousands of cases in New York alone.
Let me go back to Anna Tungan. What would be the solution in the hands of President Trump?
Well, right now he's, he just signed a bill that's going to put $500 billion available to give to people unemployed. They have a number of instances where if you are out on sick leave, you can get reimbursement for that amounts of money. There's also a plan to put money directly in the hands of individuals. And they're trying to address this issue of demand. But this is not going to be enough, unfortunately. The number is huge, but it's not enough to run the American economy and push things back to any kind of normalcy if this virus goes on for a number of months. And it's quite possible, given the very lax attitude and as Charles said, politicking that was being done here instead of preparing for what has been a very serious situation.
And I'm afraid, the alternative medical solution for President Trump might be an early discovery and the clinical trial of a vaccine. How optimistic, are you optimistic that this will be a very convincing solution? He has accepted advice, obviously, from medical experts to give everybody a test. But what about the discovery and the use of vaccination?
Well, quite frankly, I still, the medical experts have said that it takes a year to 18 months in order to come up to test and then validate that you do in fact have something that can treat the virus. Donald Trump has, the bill included testing for everybody. But this is not a situation where you can just snap your fingers and say, oh, it's going to be around the corner. He doesn't know that. No one is promising them that unless he thinks he's going to buy this German company that supposedly is going down the line. But I could tell you stories. Different companies are pushing themselves forward, saying that they think that they have the right line on this. But this is all pie in the sky. Right now, we're dealing with the next 6 months. There will not be a cure during that period, and it's incumbent upon him to come up with a financial plan and a health safety plan to protect the people of the United States. So far, that has been a little lagging and a little too little.
Thank you very much.
Actually, if I could just add on that, I think the most important thing is to stem the spread of the virus first. All of this is irrelevant if the virus is not contained and stopped. The economy will tank and continue to tank. And what I don't see is an effort to really isolate and contain the virus. Much more talk about saving Wall Street than stopping the spread of the virus.
Anthony Chen, we are talking about the U.S. economy and the global consequences. So what's your hunch about, for example, let me focus on one particular issue regarding the two biggest economies. There are allegedly some voices in the D.C. these days that there is a possibility, due to the adverse economic situation, President Trump should take into consideration proactively and positively one of the options of delaying the imposition of tax on medical exports from China to the United States for humanitarian reason, and will extend the list of getting rid of tariffs from medical equipment to other areas. What do you think of the strong prospects?
I think I've said on your network many times before that I think in this period of economic challenge that both China and the United States should remove all tariffs immediately, effectively today, if possible. I realize that that is a pipe dream on my part, but certainly in a world where global economic growth is highly challenged, not only for the United States, not only for China, but also for Europe and certainly for other parts of the world, that trying to do whatever you can to stimulate and certainly not hinder economic growth is certainly a step in the right direction. I think that so far, policymakers in all countries are probably not there yet, but that's certainly a step that would certainly be a step in the right direction.
What do you think of the prospects and chance for Bridgewater to survive the current crisis? Will Bridgewater be another Lehman back in the year 2008 when the financial meltdown took place? Anthony?
I think it's too early to start to look at which casualties will occur, because what we're seeing is a real concerted effort to try to stabilize not only financial markets but also the economy. It really is too early to see or to tell whether or not these things will be successful. With the Federal Reserve throwing in liquidity every single week, and we're going to see more than $500 billion worth of liquidity in the form of 3-month repos and certainly 1-month repos and certainly purchases of securities. The Federal Reserve now opening up facilities to support commercial paper, to support primary dealers. And of course, the federal government with all its fiscal stimulus that is being proposed and certainly going to go into effect very soon. I think that may go a long way towards stabilizing things, given that we may have learned something from the Lehman Brothers fiasco. Of course, all this will just be just part of the equation, because the real part of the equation is solving the medical situation. And I think that the vaccine is still months away, maybe even more than a year away. But I'm very encouraged that we're seeing some progress on some of the antivirals out there that may be able to at least bend the curve or at least slow down the spread of this disease. Certainly over the last 24 to 48 hours, we've been hearing some encouraging news from an antiviral coming out of Japan that is slowing down the period at which people are impacted with the virus to something in the neighborhood of 4 days or so. These are all possibilities. So far, it's
Gentlemen,
a disaster,
I'd like to have your general
let's hope
assessment
it's
about
it's
what's going to
to
happen
be
next for the U.S. economy. Voices are quite divided about the strength and resilience of the U.S. economy, and particularly dollar-denominated assets and the future of U.S. dollars. And there are even suggestions that A shares could be a sanctuary for overseas capital, given the policy option of the Chinese authorities to further open up its capital market. So my question about the future of U.S. dollars and dollar-denominated assets, Charles, your hunch?
Yeah. I think what has occurred was coming long overdue, the bursting of the bubble, because the asset prices, dollar-denominated asset, U.S., including the capital market, was too much of a bubble. And given the weakening of the U.S. government, the U.S. economy coming down from its sugar high of tax breaks, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. But I think no matter what fiscal or monetary policies are implemented, if people are locked up at home for months at a time, no going out, no restaurants, no travel, no entertainment, coffee shops are gone. If all of this continues, then all of the support or fiscal or monetary policy that's implemented is not going to make much of a difference.
Unfortunately, all of the major economies have been held hostage by the U.S. economy. We are too dependent on the U.S. dollar and financial order that was set up by the United States in the wake of the Second World War. What do you think of the future of having a digital currency and the growing importance of the euro? It might be too early to talk about the internationalization of the RMB at this stage because we haven't fully opened up our capital market. So there's no, for example, free convertibility of the RMB. There's no freedom allegedly for multinationals to move their money, US dollars, from China to other countries. I've heard a lot of stories. So given these things in my mind, what do you think of the future of the U.S. financial strength?
The U.S. dollar will eventually be replaced. The question is, it'll be one other currency or some other mechanism. Definitely, given the technology, it will be some sort of e-currency, as we've discussed before. The Bank of China has put out an e-currency. They're going to be putting it into effect. This could be the way in which China internationalizes the yuan, because it gives the government an opportunity to track where funds are going and verify that they're going for legitimate purposes. Remember, the big concern is illegitimate funds going outside of China to evade taxes or for whatever purposes. Once they get a control on that, then opening up the renminbi will be very easy. At that point, get ready for a massive shock to the U.S. system. Right now, trillions of dollars of debt have been financed, just $2 trillion over the last year. Something to think about. $1.4 trillion was spent in buying back stocks. This was after Trump announced his big windfall for the corporations. That has now all disappeared. $1.4 trillion just a year and a bit ago was there, and now it's lost forever. And instead, we have a trillion, now $2 trillion on top of the budget. With
Thank you very much. And we don't have enough time to address the issue of US dollars and the future of this world reserve currency. Let me go back to Anthony very quickly. Landslide losses in the stock and the futures market. The oil prices hit a new low point at $22 US per barrel. So how do you assess the kind of market and investment environment the world is now facing?
Well, it's a very challenging environment. Oil prices down more than 60% on a year-to-date basis. Very, very challenging, especially for the banks. Both the large center money banks and the regional banks have exposures to the energy sector, so it will be challenging. They already have challenges because of low interest rates. So there's no question that we're going to have negative economic growth now for at least 2 calendar quarters and maybe even more. The question is whether or not we find a solution to this health crisis, because if we don't find it, especially even with the antivirals, then this can cascade into a much deeper economic collapse for the U.S. and spilling over into the rest of the world. I remain hopeful, but the virus is the only one that knows when this is going to end, and at this point, the virus is not talking. So we really have to be depending on the medical professionals to tell us when this is going to be over.
Well, when the U.S. economy doesn't look very good, for example, we saw 4 trade halting within 2 weeks. They want to find someone to be blamed. For example, a campaign of stigmatizing a country in what appears to be a blame game starts to generate headlines for either the social media or big newspapers and television programs. And what do you think of this campaign of finger pointing?
This is purely political. Donald Trump has run out of options.
Counterproductive.
Yeah, he's run out of options. This is just his way of pivoting his campaign reelection, and in essence saying that China did everything bad. China is the enemy. He's the only one who's willing to fight or stand up to China. So this is an old horse. He hopes he can ride it into reelection, but that is looking very slim at this point. This is pure dog whistles to racism, and hopefully it gets no traction with the American people.
Anthony, do you see a rise of a racist campaign against China, or is it just simply a repeat of the McCarthy hysteria during the Cold War?
I certainly hope we don't see that, because it is completely counterproductive. I mean, viruses know no borders. I remember the Spanish flu in 1918. They called it the Spanish flu, but of course it started in the United States. Flus or pandemics can start anywhere. And I think for the global countries involved, the mission should be to eradicate the pandemic and not to finger point, because sooner or later, the pandemic, irrespective of where it starts, it will impact the rest of the world. This is a time for unity and global cooperation, not for finger pointing.
Charles, where do you put your money about the issue of having a kind of a cooperation between scientists from the United States and China to fight their common enemy, COVID-19? Because there are other voices that China should be decoupled technologically, economically, financially, and medically, despite the negative impact upon the livelihoods of ordinary Americans in the election year. But what do you think of the possibility of having close cooperation and coordination between scientists from the two countries?
Whether or not it's something that can be done is irrelevant. It's something that must be done. Because if you look at the WHO team that came to Wuhan, many of them were American scientists, and they worked very closely with the Chinese medical staff, medical personnel. And we're discovering also that many of the medical equipment and supplies that's needed in the U.S. need to come from China, and the Chinese are supporting the Europeans. It was widely reported in Europe that the first flight that went to Italy with the Chinese medical team carried 31 tons of medical supplies, which were desperately needed. I think China is showing that when the outbreak started, many countries supported China and was helpful, and China is supporting in return. I think the blame game, or the Chinese virus, as someone has said, I don't know if this particular virus speaks Chinese, certainly doesn't speak English, but this blame game is not a significant issue. It's not looked upon, at least I notice in the West, as something that's a big thing.
It tends to be the case that
the
people
attention.
are eager to find scapegoats in what is called, Witchhunt campaign.
Yeah,
When
sure.
epidemic broke out. Let me go to Gilbert Rougeard. Monsieur Rougeard, you are in
Hello.
Europe, and
Yes.
we are delighted and grateful for humanitarian relief that first came from some of the Scandinavian countries in the early days of the outbreak. At the same time, ironically, we saw we heard some noises using symbols and labels of racial discrimination to attack China. What do you think of this issue?
Well, look, this is totally ridiculous. I'm based in Switzerland, and we don't have this type of reaction here in Switzerland. It is common from northern countries, specifically Denmark, as you know, sometimes Sweden, but mainly Denmark. It comes from Denmark, that this type of attitude is totally outplaced. And I think media has a huge responsibility, and editors do have a huge responsibility to behave totally differently and have a different, posture on this. That's what we think here, that this is totally ridiculous. And we are really very sad to see that Europe is knocking, on the head of China, after China has done so much better right now to see how they manage to control the pandemic compared to what Europe is actually, supporting. So I think they should be rather humble and reflect and analyze later on what type of relationship we should have with China.
Something that has puzzled us, Monsieur Rougeard, is the issue of freedom of the media. Now, when killings occurred in Charlie Hebdo, the satirical publication, terrorists, of course, drew condemnation from around the world, and China showed our moral support. However, when we were talking about media freedom, the French, along with most of the people in the West, would unconditionally defend their rights to criticize, regardless of some of the religious sensitivities, like Prophet Muhammad. China is a secular country, by the way, but most of the Chinese don't feel happy about, things that may be viewed as humiliation. So when we look at the freedom of the media, do you think there should be demarcation, there should be a limit instead of having absolute unconditional freedom of the press?
Yeah, this is a tough question you ask me, as you can imagine, because I think politically, and you know this very well, that it's going to be very difficult to have state control on news and on what, of course, medias are publishing. Certainly, we have a whole string of laws all over Europe, actually, to be able to condemn people who act in this way and who, of course, disseminate racism and other attacks.
I understand your mixed feelings and your basic position about the media in the Western civilization or Western country.
Yeah,
Let me go back to...
I'm not happy at all. I'm not happy at all with this situation.
Yeah,
to
particularly
be honest
under
with
such circumstances when people are in the same boat fighting the same enemy,
yes,
despite the invisibility and the unpredictability of the virus. Let me go back to Anthony, talking about the media. Do you think Americans are indiscriminately lashing out, even at the cost of hate speech, racial discrimination, back to Senator McCarthy days? What's going on? I mean, we don't quite understand.
I certainly hope not. As a Chinese American, I certainly would be very disappointed if we pursued that path. I think in the United States we need to have freedom of speech and certainly freedom of the media, but that freedom of speech doesn't give us the right to scream fire in a crowded movie theater or a crowded concert hall and have people get hurt. And freedom of the media doesn't give us the right to promote racism. So I would hope that those type of conditions never occur. And certainly we should do everything we can within our power to discourage it, because it is completely unproductive behavior.
Anna, 4 years ago, Donald Trump, your president, rose on the platform of populism, a part of which can go back to racial discrimination. Look at the support from KKK in the campaign for him. And look at the separation of children from their parents by setting up a war between Mexico and the United States. A lot of such things happened, raising a big question mark about the basic position of President Trump about the issue of racism. I'd like to have your thoughts.
Well, I mean, my thoughts, I would agree with you that he is ostensibly a racist or promotes that or is encouraging those types of views. We've seen what he said in North Carolina when these people, this woman was run down. He kept on saying that, with the background of these marchers, Nazi marchers going around saying the Jews will not replace us. And he says, oh, there's good people on both sides. So there's not little question on it. But when you get down to different points of view, Republicans think he's great. Democrats don't. So this is the real problem. There's a political divide which has emotionally bound people to ideas where they cannot even talk to each other. Families are divided, cities, communities. It is not a thing. He has not been able to bring America together, and this is one of the problems. He's using these, and I believe he will continue to use these, especially against China, in the months to come as he tries to salvage his re-election campaign.
We are signing off. See you next time. Goodbye.